Welcome everyone to Managing Forest as Habitat in a Changing World. We have a great webinar for you guys today. The topic for today is resilient forested wetlands for wildlife, and we have some great speakers today. We have Jeff, Duck, Tim, and Christie, and we'll be introducing them more later, but we have some pre-webinar items to go over. First and foremost, we both have our wonderful ASL interpreters who I hope that you can see. If you can't, please send us a message in the chat and we'll fix that as soon as we can. We also have a captioner as well. So if you need closed captions, please go ahead and find that. That should be an option on the bottom of your screen. Let me know if you need help trying to find that. But yeah, and for those of you who are coming in via phone, more power to you. All right, I would like to start with NCTC's land acknowledgement. Here at the National Conservation Training Center, we understand that we are located on unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. While we cannot find the full account, we are aware that many peoples traversed this land and cherished it, and also lived here as well. These people include, but are not limited to, the Massawomac, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. And if you would like to learn how to get a land acknowledgement for the site that you're working at, put a message in the chat and I can send you those links. Here at NCTC, we also welcome everyone. We acknowledge agency's history to strive to be a site of cultural transformation for our organization and the larger conservation community. Here we would love to be able to represent the aspirations of the American people and the diversity that they share. And so we hope to foster an environment where everyone can learn new skills, find common ground, and explore new ways of engaging with nature. And your contribution is valid here at NCTC. Slight disclaimer, the views, positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the materials and items that are used during this webinar series are protected by copyright or may be licensed to us by third parties and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not imply federal endorsement. Also, we unfortunately can't have everyone speaking, but we do want you to participate. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat below. Also, we are going to be stopping at the end. We're going to give about a half hour at the end for questions, but do not put your questions in the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, which you can see. It's the box in red to the right. And so if you put your questions in there, we can then access them by the end of the webinar series. So we'll give it about a half hour at the end for questions. And so feel free to give our folks some good questions so we can have great discussions even at the end of the webinar. And so there are two ways to view the webinar. I might change things up a wee bit. I will say that the speaker view might be better for this webinar series. So I would suggest looking at the speaker view, see if you like it better, but we normally use the gallery view, but I've been using the speaker view myself, so give it a shot. Maybe it's better. Who knows? Opinions in the chat. And without further ado, I'll hand this over to Haven. You can get us started.
Thank you, Gwyneth. I'm Haven Barnhill. I'm acting regional forester for the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Southeast region. And on behalf of the Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group, our partners in science applications in migratory birds and the National Conservation Training Center, we're pleased to be joined by the USDA Forest Service Institute of Applied Climate Science, in sponsoring this webinar series, and we appreciate your participation. We've got over 520 folks already logged on today, and excited to bring today's webinar to you. I'm going to moderate today's discussion, and quickly I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, Mr. Jeff Denman is a consulting forester and owner of the Denman Company. Jeff's company specializes in the management of bottomland hardwoods with a focus on wildlife habitat management. Previously, Jeff spent nearly 30 years as an administrative forester with the Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System, and he led much of the forest habitat development on the White River National Wildlife Refuge. Dr. Tim Evans is the director of land conservation with Audubon, South Carolina. Previously, he served as Audubon statewide forest manager. Tim's a certified wildlife biologist, a forester, and a GIS specialist, and he spent nearly 25 years working with Anderson Tolley, a private forestry company working in the Mississippi alluvial valley that had extensive forest holdings in bottomland hardwood forest and did lots of wetland forest management. Mr. Locascio is the program manager for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the forestry section, where he supervises all of the forest management activities on state-owned wildlife management areas. Duck has managed forest resources for Louisiana wildlife and fisheries in the Mississippi alluvial valley for the last 28 years. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in forest management from Louisiana State University and a Master's of Science in wildlife management from LSU. And he's been a longtime advocate of ecologically appropriate forest management in bottomland hardwood systems. And Christie Nichols is with the Bureau of Land Management. She's the assistant field manager in the Northwest Oregon office. She has extensive experience building partnerships and managing wetland habitats. Previously, she worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a science coordinator and a habitat restoration specialist. She earned her Bachelor's of Science from Oregon State and a Master's of Science from the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff. And Christie's going to share perspective managing ecosystems substantially different from where Tim, Jeff, and Duck work. And we're very excited to have this group of panelists today. And to start with, I'd like each of the panelists to spend a few minutes providing a little more background on your experience and share a little bit about your experience managing wetland forest habitat and why it's important to you. Let's start with Jeff and then Tim, then Duck, and then Christie, if we can go in that order. So, Jeff?
Sure, thanks. After university in 1979, I began working in forestry services and forestry consulting and sawmilling, and I specialized in the bottomland forest, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, lower Mississippi Valley. And in 1982, I went to work for Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, got in the wildlife field and learned about waterfowl habitat management. I'm from Stuttgart, and ducks is what we do. The Fish and Wildlife recruited me, and I joined them in '85 and worked through 2015. It was a 150,000 acre bottomland forest, and where desired forest conditions for wildlife were developed with a lot of other folks. And since retirement from Fish and Wildlife, I've been in private practice, working for family farms and family forests, hunting clubs. They're all interested in recreational activities, hunting, wildlife observation, and such. So I help them manage for their objectives of wildlife and timber by applying DFCWs. And I'll pass it on to Duck.
Him, actually.
Okay.
Duck, you want me to go next?
I'll go. I was just trying to stay in Haven's list. He said Jeff, Tim, Duck. So I follow directions, man.
Yeah, I'll jump on in. I'm Tim Evans with Audubon, South Carolina, the Director of Land Conservation here, and I am located in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is about 40 miles up the coast from Savannah, and about 15 miles inland from the Atlantic. So very different environment than where Jeff and Duck are in the MAV. But prior to coming to Audubon, I spent 25 years occupying the space in between Jeff and Duck. Anderson Tully's land base was just about 500,000 acres and spanned from the lower end of White River Refuge down to our Black Hawk tract, which is now a property that Duck manages and Louisiana Wildlife and Fishery owns. So very familiar with the land bases that they're both working on. And then very familiar with the fact that there's a huge change when you leave the MAV behind and move to the Atlantic coast and start dealing with the riverine system wetlands and the isolated wetland Carolina Bay habitats along the coast that are very different from the MAV. Again, really what got me into this, like Jeff said, Jeff's from Stuttgart. I grew up as a kid in Pine Bluff on Bayou Bartholomew, and the idea of managing forested wetlands and bottomlands was kind of the goal of my career path from the very beginning. So didn't fall into it haphazardly. This was kind of my plan early on in my career to work in the bottomland hardwood sector. And Duck, I'll kick it to you.
All right. Thank you, Tim. So I'm the biologist program manager for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. So, Jeff, as far as geography, what Tim just laid out, I'm kind of the southern end of the Mississippi Louisville Valley. Our department owns just a little bit over, well, we own 1.5 million acres, but of the property, bottomland hardwood forests in the Mississippi Valley, we own right at 500,000 acres. So that's what I had to play with. I have a staff of 6, and the 7 of us manage that forest mainly for one objective, and that's wildlife habitat enhancement. We're a state agency providing recreational opportunities for the public, and so we're manipulating that forest to make sure all the critters that inhabit them have their niche habitat needs, boxes checked. We utilize forest management to do this, and throughout this talk, you'll hear us talking about wildlife forestry or ecological forestry, but it's because we're basically trying to create habitat conditions that meet the ecological needs of all the wildlife species that we manage for. The style of forest management that we use is basically just trying to provide vertical and horizontal structure, just a lot of structural diversity across both landscape and stand level. We're trying to provide heterogeneous canopies with gaps and multiple layering. To meet these objectives, whether it's a piece of private property or in my case, a state agency, we follow a process, and it starts with a general evaluation, kind of at the landscape scale, and just how that habitat fits into our objectives of wildlife management. We, as a department, we inventory about 50,000 acres annually so that we can get through our whole 500,000 acres in a 10-year period. We look at these 10-year snapshots and develop an entry schedule. And then that entry schedule, we enter compartments on that entry schedule to look at it a little finer, and develop forest management plans based on what the habitat requirements are for that particular compartment. And then those plans are, of course, carried out. Most of the time, it's some type of commercial harvest. We use commercial timber harvesting to provide for that habitat because it's the most cost-effective way to do it. The department, we're treating through commercial harvest about 5,000 acres annually to provide for those desired forest conditions across our land holdings. And then of course we monitor that habitat, those habitat treatments. So that's just kind of in a nutshell from an agency standpoint, what wildlife management using forest management looks like. And then just quickly my history with the department and how I came to be. I came along in '97. I was a WMA forester, just on a particular WMA. a 70,000 acre tract right there along the Mississippi River. And then I lived there for 10 years in the middle of nowhere, just enjoying life and doing what I felt like I was meant to do. After that, after 10 years, I had a little 5 year stint where I was responsible for all the property within the MAV, and that was still okay. I was still enjoying myself. And now the last 13 years, I'm responsible for the entire forestry program, which is all the land holdings, and now I manage people more than I do timber and wildlife habitat. So that's kind of my story.
Christie?
Thanks for having me today. I'm Christie Nichols. Happy to be here. It's been really cool to see everyone chime in with their locations all over the country. I've gotten to travel a bunch of this country myself, chasing my career. And as mentioned, I went to Oregon State and then the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. I've lived in 9 states, which I think is a way to develop a cool brand of patriotism for the natural landscapes and species in our country. And so I started my career just with an intention of doing good things for fish and wildlife. I did a lot of different fisheries research investigations, and it landed in Klamath Falls in the Upper Klamath Basin, and started working on private land restoration. And that was quite a good introduction into land management, as well as trying to seek out win-win situations with private landowners where they could do a management action that benefited their ranch or farm, but was also a good action for the local fish and wildlife. I just surpassed my 1 year at BLM after leaving Fish and Wildlife Service, and my job here, which is what landed me in this square on your panel member team, I manage the West Eugene wetlands for the Northwest Oregon District out of the Siusla field office for BLM. And so that's a 3,000 acre wetland area that borders the city of Eugene, Oregon. And so we have quite an interesting mix of multi-use. That includes urban settings, city limits. We have quite an encampment and illegal use problem that we try to manage for legal uses. And on top of that, we have a recreation program. We have ash forest and oak forest. We have a unique subspecies of pine for the Willamette Valley here. And then a whole smattering of federal, state, and bureau-sensitive species, plants, insects, birds, mammals, and lots of different waterways. So happy to be here. Thanks for introducing me.
Thank you all. And as a reminder, as we go along, we'd ask participants to please put your questions in the Q&A. And for process, we're going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes with a few moderated questions, and then we'll roll into the participant provided questions. So first question for the panelist is, describe the natural disturbance processes that significantly influence forest structure and composition in your work area, and how have they changed in the ecosystems that you manage? And Tim, let's start with you.
Yeah, Hurricane Helene is something that's still fresh on everybody's mind right now. And along the Atlantic coast, hurricanes are the primary driver of succession within riparian corridors. The reality, though, is as we've lost acres in those riparian forest types, the odds of having a good hurricane event, and I say good in a forest regeneration perspective, and hitting the sites that need to be regenerated have declined. So counting on natural occurrences to drive regeneration in bottomlands has become a really, really hit or miss scenario. And so meeting with South Carolina Forestry Commission after Helene and looking at the pattern of the damage that we saw, it was not wide scale leveling of forests. It was a patchwork of downdraft microburst events that would flatten areas within bottomlands. Looked at a lot of sites, and without upsetting landowners as much as possible, my major takeaway was that Hurricane Helene was probably a net positive for bottomland hardwood systems within South Carolina, just because they had been neglected. They weren't actively being managed. There wasn't a real push to develop advanced regeneration in a lot of those sites. And so this is probably the most significant regeneration event in bottomland sites in the Carolinas in the past century. So, hurricanes are the huge driver here. And the follow up to a hurricane is a good flood. As it moves inland and goes into the Piedmont and the mountains, it drops rainfall, and then that water all comes back down to the areas that were just impacted by the hurricane. So, major weather events, hurricanes and floods are the two big drivers here. They have to be, because unlike the MAV, the landowner drive to manage these sites is just not nearly as strong in the Atlantic coastal plain as it is when you get into the Mississippi Valley.
Thank you, Tim. Let's go to Jeff, and then Duck. We'll kind of work our way down the river.
Yeah, Tim said that wind and ice storms are the major natural disturbances to the tree canopy. Flooding is really periodic, almost annually, and it has influences on the understory. The Mississippi Valley has the benefit of real rapid growth response to the additional sunlight, and rapid decomposition rates to the down woody material. So we see quite a quick turnover of the woody material, and so we emulate those disturbances through partial cuts to get the sunlight to the forest floor to stimulate the vegetation, and sometimes some more severe disturbances to get sufficient sunlight to get established the desired reproduction of oaks and other shade intolerant species, so that we can perpetuate the oak dominated forest in the MAV. Yep.
Yeah, for us, Jeff just mentioned ice. So I'm on the lower end of the Mississippi Louisville Valley, and so we don't get much ice damage. It's extremely in my career, it's only happened once, which 30 years is not a long period of time, but Jeff gets a lot more ice. We do get a lot of hurricanes, just like Tim said, and I'll echo everything he just said and keep me from describing it. That's exactly right. They're horrible for private property. But they're a good thing for the ecosystem. I mean, that's what sets back secession. Without it, you end up with just dark forest, which there are winners in dark forest. There are species that enjoy dark forest, but there are species that need a lot of light on the ground and early successional habitat, and hurricanes provide that. And then just some other things that we encounter that haven't been talked about is drought. So it's another natural disturbance. It's fresh in my mind because we just came off of two record-setting droughts in the last 5 years. It causes significant amount of mortality, which changes the habitat. And again, winners and losers. We to a landowner, an agency, it hurts when you lose timber to drought mortality. And it is a commodity. It's tough pill to swallow to just totally lose it, but it becomes snags and coarse wooded debris on the ground, and it's important attributes for wildlife habitat. But more importantly, it provides canopy gaps for light to get to the ground, for regeneration to happen, to provide those niche habitats and more early successional habitat for those species that need that. And then Jeff mentioned flooding. Flooding's significantly can change our habitat. And he talked about the actual flood, but also floods bring in sedimentation, and sedimentation can change species composition. It can provide for regeneration. So yeah, we all rely on natural disturbances, and we only really supplement those with the management that we do. But we're always not only relying on them, but keeping them in the back of our mind and kind of manage towards them and with them and not against them. But
Thank you, Dr.
Well,
Christie.
yeah, thanks. From the opposite end of the element spectrum, we're dealing with fire up here in the northwest part of Oregon, or of the nation. So there's several habitat types that we manage out of my office. I'm speaking specifically about the West Eugene wetlands. The fire regime is alive and well in the uplands in addition, but in the West Eugene wetlands, interestingly, the fire regime was introduced by indigenous peoples. And so the 3,000 acres that I mentioned, it's in a mixed ownership of Army Corps of Engineers, BLM, City of Eugene, Lane County, and private. And we all work together collectively each year for ecological burning. And that is something I view as a passing of the baton, because prior to the European settlement of the area, burning was happening for hundreds of years prior. And that was to open the canopies. And had that not been happening, our 3,000 acres that I keep referencing would be an ash forest. Right now, it is not that. It's an open prairie, wetland prairie, with a periphery of oak, pine, and ash. And so it's a really interesting history of the area, and it brings a lot of interesting challenges as well with that mixed ownership, and in an urban area or on the periphery of an urban area. We're having to utilize, well, we do our best to burn every year. Last year, we were unable to get our burn done due to wind and air quality concerns because we're in such a populated area. And so then we have to turn to mowing and mastication and all these multi-use considerations.
Thank you, Christie. Quickly, I'd like to follow up on the disturbances just a little bit with a question, thinking about places like the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, where there are literally thousands of miles of levees. Many of the tributaries have been dammed. There's ditches and dikes everywhere in that ecosystem. Has that affected the function of the ecosystem, and does it impact management decisions that you make on the ground? And maybe Duck and Jeff, if y'all would like to take a quick shot at that as a follow-up.
yeah, I'll start. I mean, so yes to everything you just said. Yeah, we're very aware of the hydrological changes that have happened across the valley. And we kind of attack it from two fronts. One, just the practitioners that work on these WMAs for years. You kind of have the institutional knowledge, and you have a feel for the direction the forest is headed, because the changes are affecting species composition. It may be getting drier, it may be getting wetter. You may have a situation where it was a groundwater dependent system that has become strictly a surface water dependent system. So there's that. And then we partner with universities constantly, and we're actually partnering with LSU Ag Center right now to look at hydrological changes on a few of our WMAs, looking at channelization and levee work that was done, over the last couple of decades. And we're basically an oak forest, or predominantly oak forest, is rapidly changing in front of our eyes. In fact, one of my foresters sent me some preliminary data from plots he took just a few days ago. But now it's a heavy clay soils, water hickory, overcup type forest that's drying out. Those two species can't really make it anymore, and it's being replaced by light-seeded species, shade-tolerant light-seeded species like sugarberry, and with no other hard mass species coming in. So yeah, so for a practitioner to understand that, know what's happening, and then we can take steps to manage towards something, right? To maybe supplement plant another hard mass species that should be on the site, but the seed source is not available. Because had it just happened slowly, Mother Nature's way, it would have been a more gradual process. But when things dry out quickly, in this case of this example, then you might not have the seed source that would naturally be on that site in that hydrological state at the time on those soils. But so yeah, yes, the answer is yes to all those. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, the man-made changes to the hydrological period is, with the clearing and ditching and urbanization, so we get quicker runoff. And we also seem to, at the other extreme, the Mississippi River is contained, doesn't meander anymore, so it's incising a deeper channel. So the base elevation of the Mississippi continues to decrease. So when the Mississippi River's really low, it's really far down in the banks. It's got a range of elevations of about 50 feet. It can be 20 feet down in the banks, and it can be 30 feet up into the trees. Both extremes, I think, have been exaggerated from the alterations we've had, and so it does add a lot of challenges to providing a habitat for the wildlife and fish when they need it and where they need it. But we just have to go with what falls out of the sky and what runs down the river. But when a little creek like the Mississippi River rises 50 feet, it's a lot of water.
Thank you, Jeff.
Jeff, I might argue that it's even more extreme in the White River system.
In a sense, it is. We have flood control lakes on the Upper White, and the major one is now 30 feet above normal pool. So our experiences with the Corps and their rule curve, they'll dribble the water out bank full through the summer. It doesn't look too bad from the bank because you're standing on the natural levee, but the back swamps right behind the natural levee will stay inundated. We're looking through the beginning or even end of September, and flooded during the growing season. We're seeing a lot of mortality from real water tolerant species such as overcup oak. Over the last 7 years, we've been in a wet cycle. We had a dry cycle the last 2 years where the river receded in the spring somewhat normally, but it's not in the cards for us this summer because the spring storms are getting and to release that overabundance of water. It'll keep our woods flooded for months.
Hey, Haven, I would add from a perspective of those man-caused changes in ditching and drainage, there's about 400,000 acres of land between Jacksonville, North Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida, that were cleared bottomland sites for rice culture in the Carolinas, starting back in the 1600s, heavily ditched, heavily impacted, and an amazing amount of earth moved to create these levee ditched, tidally influenced impoundments right at the mouth of all the major river systems coming out of the Carolinas. Those sites, when they were abandoned, came back, they reforested, and you kind of know the mix you get when you abandon agriculture in those sites. Completely unnatural mixes within those, but still open to really altered hydrology. So an altered species mix, altered hydrology. I'm working on one right now, about a 400-acre Carolina Bay that was ditched and drained and converted to rice culture. When it was abandoned, loblolly pine became the primary species in the bottom of this old Carolina Bay. And you know, we're about to restore hydrology to the site. And we just finished up a cruise on it and looking at about 800,000 feet of loblolly pine in this Carolina Bay that we're about to put water back into. So, you know, the idea of restoring these sites that have been impacted through that ditching and drainage many times is a discussion of number one, what do I do with the stand that's there that I'm about to impact to move into the restoration of the stand that historically should have been there.
Thank you. Let's start out west and head east on this next one. Describe important habitat components, something we may call desired forest or habitat conditions in the areas that you manage. Kind of paint a picture of what you're after.
Yeah. Well, the different kinds of habitats that we're trying to manage for include the kind of different habitat types I've mentioned. The oak knolls. We have black and white oak. We have the ash forest, which, you know, I know one of the nationwide issues is the emerald ash borer, and we're trying to figure out what to do when the closest population of ash borer is 60 miles away and probably is here. So we expect that to be imminent. And then down in the bottom of our Willamette River Valley, where the wetlands are that we manage, our open prairie habitat that's been important for several different specific plant and butterfly species. Neotropical birds, migratory birds. We're looking at northwestern pond turtle, monarch. I'm trying to remember the bumblebee species that was just proposed for listing. So, you know, on a landscape scale, it's interesting to talk about on our several miles north, south, east, west, what are the landscapes looking like? But then, you know, specifically in the microhabitat of where are these 20 Kincaid's lupine that the Fender's blue butterfly are using. So it's an interesting. Oh, thank you, the Suckley's cuckoo. Thank you. So yeah, it's just different scales that we have to assess on the landscape that we're looking at, and then zeroing in on the populations that are important to the habitat, the species that we're trying to manage for with the habitat types we're trying to manage. So those are the things we're looking at. I was kind of, in our assessment of me participating in the panel, I was kind of joking, like, well, one of the biggest things I do is mow grass. That's one of my biggest actions out here. And I know that that's a lot different than what you're experiencing in the Southeast. But it is really important for keeping that, you know, the invasives back. That we have the Himalayan blackberry, which is a big deal. So those are some of the components that we're managing for out here.
Thank you, Christie. Jeff?
So when it comes to habitat components, we come to realize the structure in the forest seems to be more important than the species of the trees. And the structure is key for cover and food resources for wildlife. We determined desired forest condition for wildlife. It started back in the late 80s when we termed it desired future conditions. We're looking to see where's the forest condition going to provide the habitats that we need. So I'd like to start the slides. And if we come up with the first slide, you know, as a Forester Fish and Wildlife Service, I thought myself more of a biologist. I just specialized in large plants and managed the habitat to produce the wildlife that we needed. And in the early 90s, came to realize Duck's predecessor was managing quite the same way, and we teamed up to get the desired forest conditions for wildlife going. It was real interesting to learn and work with up to 75 other scientists as we develop these things. When it comes to wildlife habitat, it's at two scales. It's at the landscape scale. So we determined what we thought was most advantageous for wildlife, and for forest managers to take a look at the landscape scale. And so you put the landscape scale and the stand scales habitat qualities together, and you can have productivity. Next slide, please. And so here's at the stand scale. We drilled down, and these figures are from our revision. With the DFCW publication was in 2007, and we've been revising it. It's real close to being in print, but here's the tables. One of the main things we changed in the controlling factors is really controlling sunlight. That's overstory canopy cover. And we use basal area as a surrogate. We changed from absolute basal area value to more of a relative basal area values, because different stands have different productivities. And so it worked together better. And if you go on to the next slide, we give an example of creating these multi-canopy forests that provide all the niches for migratory birds that are available. And what seems to be good for neotropical migrant songbirds is also good for waterfowl and white-tailed deer and eastern turkey and all the wildlife we found ourselves to be in charge with. Next slide, please. And so having this diverse and ample structure and coarse woody debris and this understory vegetation, we found ourselves considering fish habitat, as these are flooded anywhere from 6 inches deep to 10 to 20 or 30 feet deep. But fish come out of the oxbow lakes or the shallow depressions, and the fry go into these dense vegetated areas for their food sources and for cover. And so these vast forests are fish nurseries as well. And so the ornithologists got a kick out of it when we start talking about fish management and forestry for fish. So then for private landowners, now in my private practice, I use forest stewardship plans and American Tree Farm System to educate landowners and implement DFCWs that's benefiting the waterfowl or the deer. If they have more ducks, if they have more deer, that's success to them. But we're able to benefit neotropical migrant songbirds, pollinators, the whole gamut of wildlife that use these forests. So with that, I'll pass it along.
Doug?
Yeah, I'll and Jeff and I, we've been working pretty closely our careers, and we manage the same landscapes and have basically had the same set of objectives. So I won't repeat what he said, but I'll summarize, and I'll be quick because he already covered a lot of it. If you think about it, the way we manage, we're not managing certain species. We let the forest dictate the species based on the soil type and elevation. And we try not to fight Mother Nature. We're going to accept that sweetest species, tree species, that should be on the site. But what we do try to manipulate is the forest structure. Depending on what forest structure we put on the ground, that's that diversity of habitats that we can put on the ground. And we look at it from two standpoints, from a landscape scale. And if you just think of it across a landscape or a property or your management unit, we're just trying to provide early successional habitat, mid successional habitat, and late successional habitat. Or you could think of it as forest structure, early successional habitat, very lush, thick, dense, low growing. There's critters that need that. Flip side is a late successional habitat, big, dark forest, limited understory, limited mid-story. There's critters that like that, like red-eyed vireos say. And then we want to manage somewhere in the middle. And we always talk about managing on thirds. We basically want our landscape about a third of each of those. And then within those, at the stand level, when we're actually, writing prescriptions and management plans for a forest stand, we just want that stand, no matter what successional stage it might be in, we want it to be as diverse as possible. So we want it very diverse in species. Whatever species can be there, we like them to be represented. So we really don't manage for or against a certain species of plant or tree. And then we just want good diversity of diameter, size, age, arrangement, or stocking. And when you have all those, you end up with a fairly structurally diverse, both horizontal and vertical forest structure in each of those, three successional stages. And that's, I hope to just kind of simplify it because it can become so complex to wrap your brain around desired forest conditions for wildlife in bottomland hardwood forests in the southeast. But that's kind of as simple as I could try to make it.
Thank you, Doug. Tim, how about you in desired forest conditions?
Yeah, Jeff and Duck kind of hit the nail on the head. Structure. With us, it's all about structure. And if Gwyneth, could you bring my slides up? And I've just got a couple. One of the documents that I for bedtime reading is Wharton et al. And this is kind of a slide that Duck and Jeff and folks who do this know this well. We've seen it a million places, and it's an idea about things grow in certain places when you get into a bottomland system, and it's a function of soil age, soil structure, soil acidity, clay deposition, permeability. And so you go from a front and a first levee to a terrace to a sweet gum red oak ridge to a back swamp to a cypress tupelo drain as you move between the riverine system to the upland. If you go into the document from Wharton et al., there's a drawing of this for a number of Atlantic coast riverine systems showing how this occurs. And you may be in South Louisiana and this happens over a 5 or 6 or 8 mile wide area, or you could be on the Edisto River in South Carolina and this happens inside of a half a mile. But the basic structure is still in place with how these systems deposit material. And so, we try to work within what does the site want to produce, not trying to force species into places where the site doesn't want to support them, but trying to put structure where the site is going to be most valuable. And go to the next slide, and I'll let my bias show through. I work for the Audubon Society, so birds are kind of our thing. But I'll go back to early in my career. The very first job I ever did when I was hired by Anderson Tully Company is Mike Staten, who several of you remember Mike, and great forester and biologist that he was to work with. Mike handed me this stack of wrinkled papers, which was the first draft of this breeding bird field manual, and said, go edit this. And in my career, I've been asked by bosses before, are foresters birders? And I've always responded, not if you ask them. If you go and you ask foresters, are you a birder? They typically say no. But then every one of them has a pair of binoculars and a bird book back in their truck because they see things and they're curious and they want to know. And so what we did in this field manual was look at structure and how structure impacted bird communities and the suite of bird species that would occur in these bottomland sites based on the structure that was resulting from forest management or lack of forest management. And so we're actively involved through Audubon right now with Louisiana State University, working on Swainson's warblers and looking at Swainson's warbler as a species that is tied to early successional bottomland habitat for breeding. And the idea that if we're creating good Swainson's warbler habitat by creating that early successional structure, we're also creating good habitat for Kentucky warblers and hooded warblers and red-eyed vireos and yellow-breasted chats and other species that are going to hang around those same habitats. At the same time, we're working with LSU and the University of Georgia on prothonotary warblers. And this is something that is not going to be in those early successional habitats, but is going to be in late successional habitat, uniquely tied to cavities, in cavity nesting. And so through what we call bird-friendly forestry, which is kind of Audubon's take on DFCs, we have looked at forest interior birds and the idea that in a given tract of forest, so long as 90% of the tract is in a late successional stage, forest interior birds go, yeah, I can ignore 10% being tied up in early succession. And then we moved into, well, what is late succession? And we get into the idea that, well, as long as there's 50 to 70% crown cover, canopy closure, I deem most of these forest interior birds deem that that's still closed canopy forest interior. So as we implement things like thinnings and patch clear cutting on these sites, we exactly what Duck said, we can maintain that diversity of diversity by looking at what point do birds still consider closed canopy in spite of thinning, and at what point can you implement early successional habitat without impacting forest interior birds. So trying to use birds as the key to determine those numbers that Jeff pointed out with DFCs. What's the right amount of basal area or percentage of crown cover or amount of sunlight you have to get to the ground to get that mid-story developed. So, we're all working on the same numbers. We're all looking for structure. We all want ground cover and mid-story, and then we want an overstory. And for things like swallowtail kites, I need a big super emergent every now and then poking through the canopy, sticking 30 or 40 feet up higher. That's really going to be that spot that attracts things like swallowtail kites. So structure is absolutely number one.
Well, I learn every time I join these webinars. This is fabulous. Got a whole pile of more questions to ask, but let's get to management, recognizing that ecological forestry emulates natural disturbances. Describe some of the silvicultural practices that you use and how they emulate or maybe don't emulate natural processes. And Tim, let's just start right with you and head west from there.
Yeah, number one is group selection harvesting. I've spent a career where we started out with single tree selection, thinking that was a viable alternative, and we rapidly moved from single tree to small group to really getting into larger group selections. The idea that we've kind of settled on and that we're working with is that anything less than about 2 acres, we found just is so short-lived in its impact that it's almost not worthwhile. That really we're looking at somewhere in the 3 to 10 acre size for group selections to have real impact in terms of the early successional habitat, and then utilizing that thinning around those group selections as a tool to basically create that next level of advanced regeneration, because loss of oak is a huge impact. Duck had mentioned it in Louisiana. It's huge in the Carolinas as well, that past cutting practices have favored light-seeded species and species that will root sprout or coppice, so that you've lost oak in those areas. So really focusing on establishing advanced regeneration through thinning practices, and where you have advanced regeneration to release, focusing on patch clear cutting. So combining patch clear cutting with adjacent thinnings and being able to move that patch clear cut over time. I mentioned prothonotary warblers, and we look at those birds, and they're cavity nesters, and they'll leave the Carolinas, they go to Columbia, they come back to the very same tree, looking to nest in the same hole. Whereas Swainson's warblers are looking for habitat, and they're looking for a habitat type that moves across the landscape over time. And so they're always looking for that next patch of basically 1 to 5 year old fresh cut, whether that's a hurricane blowdown or a brand new group selection cut. they're looking for that habitat type that moves across the landscape. And so, being able to make sure that we've got the next spot planned where that habitat's going to move to as the last patch grows out is important for managing for those suites of bird species that we're most interested in.
Thank you, Tim. Duck, anything to add?
Yeah, I guess we basically all got a guy working for Bird Conservation Agency and a guy on private land working strictly for wildlife objectives, and then like a guy like me, um, we all utilize all the silvicultural tools. So just like Tim said, you'll use small gaps, right? Individual tree selection or small groups to set the stage to begin to get natural regeneration. And then you'll use large group patch clear cuts or even large clear cuts, depending on how big a regeneration patch you have to release it. And all of them mimic natural disturbance. Individual tree selection or very small groups are much like tree fall gaps that you get from hurricane or strong wind that comes through and knocks down 30% of the canopy across, vast areas across a stand. That you can mimic that, or we are mimicking that with thinning operations. And it's not necessarily individual tree selection I think of as a light thinning or a thinning. When I start adding groups, I think of it as a little heavier thinning. Then we use large groups or patch clear cuts to release regeneration. And those are mimicking even a heavier handed disturbance, right? So big tornadic activity or something. So, as far as across a landscape before it was piecemealed and just patches of habitat, when we had a lot of habitat throughout the valley, along the northeast, throughout the country, natural disturbance would lay down a lot of timber and provide for all these habitats. Now all of us practitioners are doing it on just the woodlots that we manage, and we really can't wait for natural disturbance to come through. But we're all using silvicultural techniques that basically mimic natural processes and are so important for the wildlife habitat that we're trying to put on the ground. Christie's turn.
Thank you. Jeff, anything to add?
Yeah, we're using canopy gaps to get sunlight penetration, both large and small, so that we can get the vegetative response that so much of this wildlife, whether fish or pollinators or waterfowl or neotropic mimic songbirds, they depend on to provide them the cover and the structure, the cover and the food resources. And then talking about prothonotary warblers, they're cavity nesters, but they're not excavators. They have to depend on a lot of primary excavators to create the cavities during the winter. So then they have a cavity to use in the breeding spring and summer seasons. So it so much as replicating what nature will do over the long term. We speed the process up, and we can do so because these forests are so resilient, fast growth rates, fast deterioration rates. It changes quickly with and without disturbances, but all this wildlife they're all disturbance dependent, just at different scales.
Thank you, Jeff. I know, Christie, you had previously mentioned fire and the use of mechanical disturbance to maintain your ecosystems. Were there any other practices that you would want to share?
Those are the two main ones. The interesting part that I think is pertinent to this conversation is that in places where either we can't burn anymore due to infrastructure that's been built nearby, or not meeting air quality requirements to be able to burn, it puts us in a place of having to then kind of artificially select for which individuals or which stands or how it's going to regenerate. So I was just in an oak stand last week on the Long Tom River talking about, well, we haven't been able to burn here. How are we going to decide which of these oaks are the up and coming regeneration group is going to make it, because the fire would have done that for us before. So it's just an interesting conundrum that we deal with.
Thank you. We have a tremendous number of questions already in the Q&A, so we're going to pause here. I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay Grayson, Fish and Wildlife Service forester in Michigan, and she's been monitoring the Q&A, and she's going to share those questions, and we'll move pretty quick on that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Like Haven said, we do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to do my best to get us through these. Starting off, how would you recommend something like the one-third, one-third, one-third model, or in any really aspect, including multiple structures and a highly diverse forest structure for small woodland owners and small landowners?
Yeah, I get that. We get that question all the time. You need to figure out how your small property, what what that part of your property makes up that landscape. It it you would not be providing the habitat if you only had 40 acres and you tried to manage on thirds. First of all, you couldn't do it mechanically because you'd never get a commercial operation onto such a small, say, timber sale. But think about how your property is important to the overall landscape. And if your neighbor, just had a 40-acre clear cut that's early successional habitat, and you have a little bit later successional habitat, maybe you hold on to yours a little bit longer before you thin it. Conversely, if you're in a forest where nothing much has happened lately, then I wouldn't break my property into thirds. I would treat my entire property, if I had a small land holding, knowing what it meant to the larger landscape.
Yeah, I agree with the landowners I work with, with 100 acres or even 150 acres, it's just not feasible to divide it up into small portions and micromanage each one. As these landowners started getting up into the 500, 600 acre sizes, then I often recommend they disturb half their forest, and 5, 7 to 10 years later disturb the other half by having a variable retention improvement thinning in one, a pause and get the benefits of that action, and then set up the other. And I've got the 5,000 acre landowners and the 10,000 acre landowners. They can be having some thinnings on pretty good portions of it every 2 or 3 years to really rejuvenate the habitat across their mini landscape. But small landowners, it is hard to apply. It's pretty much all or none, and a little bit of boom or bust. But as Doug said, they know their neighbors. They know what their neighbors have done. Can't really predict what they will do, but we try to kind of fit in between them and provide the range of resources for wildlife.
I'll echo what Jeff and Duck said, that it's all about scale and understanding how your particular property fits within the larger landscape and what's going on around you, and not trying to do everything all the time on just what you're owning and managing, but understanding what's going on with your neighbor's property and how what you're doing is either detracting from or benefiting what's going on next door to you.
Thank you. As many of you talked about, natural disturbances are necessary for ecosystem function, but they come with a lot of trade-offs to landowners and to our other land use needs. Do you have any thoughts about how land management could change to better facilitate resilience to natural disturbance, or how it could be balanced against those other goals? And then, sort of as a sub one to that, Tim, I think specifically, how are hurricanes specifically influencing your management and your selection of a management style?
Yeah, I'll jump right in because that's been a big deal. Jeff and Duck, if I say the word advanced regeneration, they know exactly what I'm talking about. If you come to the Carolinas and say advanced regeneration, people stare at you like they don't know what language you're speaking. And lots of landowners with bottomland hardwood tracts will contact me and say, I'd like to regenerate my stand. Would you come take a look? And I get there and it's a fresh clear cut. And I go, you should have called me before you did this. The idea of the mentality that there's a pine mentality that's being applied to bottomland stands, and the idea that I tell folks loblolly pine regeneration comes out of a box in the back of a truck, and oak regeneration comes out of the trees that are already on your stand. And trying to educate landowners here about doing intermediate treatments to encourage the development of advanced regeneration ahead of the idea to do that final harvest. So with things like hurricanes, I'm often tasked afterwards. There's been a hurricane, there have been spot tornadoes that have gone through, a landowner's property is damaged. They immediately want to go in. And Duck will remember at Sherburne a while back, we had a meeting and had groups looking at a site, and several would say, you know, what would you do here? And they'd immediately start talking about planting. And I always argue planting is always your last resort in a bottomland site. If you can naturally regenerate it, that's what you always need to do. And so working with landowners to understand that the most resilient thing you can do on these sites is have advanced regeneration existing in the understory, so that when there's a hurricane, when there's a tornado, when there's one of these major events that damages the overstory and impacts the canopy, your next stand's already established and ready and coming forward. If it's not, when that happens, then you're in a situation where what you have underneath is a lot of privet and box elder and chinaberry and species that you may not want to be your next stand, but you haven't done the work to get oak established. So, you know, the greatest resilience I can recommend, especially along the Atlantic coast, is that landowners have to do more to get advanced regeneration of desirable species present on their sites, so that when one of these major altering events happens, they're at least prepared for it.
When I invited onto private landowners' property and do an evaluation of the habitat conditions, it's not unusual for stand or portions to have pretty good conditions, pretty much fall within our desired ranges. And so I commonly recommend they allow continue to grow as is, providing the habitat functions, and reevaluate it every 5 years. And if there's not a natural disturbance comes along, such as a major windstorm or ice storm, then they're probably going to need to open the overstory canopy up in 10, 15 years. So it's fairly common to take advantage of the disturbances they've already had, whether it was a natural disturbance or whether they did a timber cut, just to take it, you know, to enjoy the fruits of those efforts or circumstances. And then in the park-like stands, a closed canopy, start getting some sunlight in there to get the desired trees established that'll provide the functions of the habitat.
We talked a lot about desired conditions and the desired stand coming up. And I think a lot of times things come up when we talk about, you know, return to historic variability, historic range of conditions. Are we managing for natural or original condition or historic condition or pre-European contact condition or just ecological functionality? And sort of alongside that, do you have a procedure for when you would decide that you might need to plant species that are better suited than what might be, you know, the native or on-site species composition?
I'll take the first stab at it. So we're managing, to answer the first part of the question, we're probably managing for ecological function. Because we're managing for species, we're as a state agency, we're almost mandated, right? We're part of joint ventures, we're part of conservation organizations with targets of populations of species that we're trying to provide on the landscape. So to go back to what historically was there, to try to figure that out would be laborious. But at this point, we're trying to provide for the ecological functions and life history needs of the species that we can provide for with the limited landscape we have. Like in the Mississippi River Valley, we've lost 70% of the forest. So we're trying to pack all those critters on 30% of what's still remaining in the valley. Everything else is rice, corn, cotton, and beans. So that's what we do, and then how we do it, we're letting the habitat needs of those species kind of dictate how we manage, and that's where we come up with the desired forest conditions. And then as far as species, it's tough to. Yes, I know I'm drying up in some areas. I know I have wetlands turning to marsh, and I have low wetlands kind of invading my higher ground as because I'm a coastal state, as marsh migrates northward. But we almost kind of just let those natural things happen to try to plan for and plant or supplement plant to make a species shift is tough. And just what Tim described earlier in the earlier question, when you're managing hardwood with the number of species that are out there that we manage for, what's standing is what dictates the regeneration you get. And then as the site changes over time and you lose those species, you're going to lose that regeneration, and you can maybe supplement plant, but to think that you're going to plant a new forest of a whole different species composition to be successful, that is an uphill battle.
And
So
how does that apply specifically to something like an ash swamp that sometimes has 60, 70, 90% one species?
Right. Now, you can only supplement like an ash swamp, and those come up from time to time on our property. I don't hardly manage against them. I mean, most time they come up as a monoculture because it was dry at just the right time and you got just the right ash regeneration. And then they're normally overstocked, and then stems start falling out due to stem exclusion phase without me even touching them. And that's where prothonotary warblers are, because all of a sudden there's so many cavities, it's too many cavities. So we don't fight against, or at least our agency, we're gonna try to work with whatever naturally is compositional changes are happening on the property.
Christie, how does that kind of maybe contradict what you're doing?
Well, first, I wanted to say that series of questions is such an important one because we find the answers to those questions in our mission statements and our goals and objectives. And for me, our BLM has resource management plans, and that's what I adhere to. If that's not a good answer for you, and that's a personal question that you're asking, you need to align those questions with the agency that you're working for. Anyway, I just think that those foundational questions are so important as we move forward with these management questions, because we get stuck in rabbit trails and nitty gritty and details of what we're trying to do. And I find that as I bring people back, well, what's the goal here? What are we trying to accomplish here? What is our mission? Keep revisiting those. So I just wanted to highlight that. But as Duck said, ecosystem management, one of the biggest things, and I've been remiss to not say this. I mean, if people are familiar with the Willamette Valley, the habitat type that I'm talking about, the open wetland prairie, there's less than 1% left of it in the Willamette Valley. And that's the bottom land of what I'm working with here and it's surrounded by forested wetland, which is the nexus of why I'm in this seat. But that's my answer is ecosystem restoration, ecosystem habitat types, and agency mission.
In everyone's work, a lot of this requires obviously machinery. How are you managing the disturbance and soil compaction? And Christie, you brought up, DEQ. How are you dealing with all of those sort of abiotic factors, or maybe even community factors in the very practical aspects of getting the work done?
Yeah,
well, I'm really lucky. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I can say I will chime in on that one. That there are soil types that I just simply won't work in. They are so fragile and so subject to damage from any kind of machinery that there are some sites we just won't go into to take machinery into those. We're dealing with the Carolina forest fire in Horry County that's been burning for about 6 months now in organic peat soils. And until we get enough rain on that one to put it out, it's just constantly cutting line and letting the fire move underground through peat. So really those very fragile organic soils, some of them you just don't go into.
In the Mississippi Valley, we have clay and sandy soils, so we restrict equipment during dry seasons when the compaction really doesn't occur. We don't want heavy traffic out there cutting ruts and really causing severe soil disturbance. It degrades the site, and the vegetation won't respond as well. So we do restrict heavy equipment to a dry season so we don't have the soil compaction. But we don't restrict the size of the equipment because we have a lot of times we have a mid-story made up of shade tolerant species, and the destructive nature of logging is part of what controls that without a great expense. So it almost seems to oppose itself, but having some destructive logging will help to get the sunlight we need to stimulate the vegetation we are seeking, from herbaceous all the way up to the shade intolerant regeneration of oaks and other desirable species of trees. So it's a careful balance.
Christie,
Jeff,
you popped on
I like what you said, and something I share with folks, especially private landowners, is that we can have a tendency to be too careful sometimes. And I've stressed that, especially with red oak, that red oak likes a little bit of a beat up site. It likes some exposed mineral soil. It likes a little more site activity, and that you can be too careful to the point that you prevent yourself from regenerating oak on sites. So you don't want to rut, you don't want to tear up. At the same time, a little bit of scarification is a good thing.
When you do that scarification or really have any of these disturbances that are bringing sunlight and soil disturbance, invasive species can become a real problem, especially if there's already a seed bank for it, machinery can bring things in, etc. How are you dealing with invasive species in general? How are you dealing with them at scale?
Yeah, I'll start that off. Um, it can be easy. It's easy to just decide not to do work, right? Say, man, when we open this up, it's going to get taken over by, and just fill in the blank, Chinese tallow, common privet, whatever it might be. But without the disturbance, right? We're managing for disturbance dependent wildlife. If we don't make the disturbance, then the habitat's lacking. It's not there. And therefore, the species we manage for won't be there. So the only way to do it is have a pretty from the ground up type procedure where you're always trying to monitor, you're always trying to treat and keep in control those invasives on the property, such that when you do open up the stand, they don't just take it. So that means prior to a harvest, doing some tallow tree control so that those larger tallow trees that are on the site, or maybe down that right of way, right down the road that you're aware of, that you go ahead and take care of those before you do the treatment. Because it's easier to go treat 10 or 15 tallow trees, out on the edge of a forest than thin 250 acres, and then find out 5 years later that you have 250 acres of tallow. Now, we have a lot of flooding, overbank flooding, and spring flooding. We have invasive species float in, right? So in that case, you just have to stay on top of it. As soon as you the treatment happens, you're gonna have to follow up, monitor, and control invasives. But I wouldn't let it. We have this debate within our agency constantly about maybe we shouldn't do it there because of whatever invasive species might pop up. But I mean, if you get into that habit, then you're not gonna do any forest disturbance. So I would just caution folks to just yeah, manage it and control it as best you can, but don't keep it from you doing good work.
Lindsay, I was kind of laughing at your my response initially in my head to your question was, how do you manage this? And my answer is constantly. And so what Duck said is right. And post burn, we do seeding. You just try to mitigate for those invasives and keep going always.
I've gotten beaten up more than once by beekeepers associations when I talk about dealing with privet and chinaberry, in that local beekeepers love it. These are species they rely on, and at the same time, I'm a bird guy, and we all know how tallow tree gets spread. It's birds. We just published a paper with Clemson University on controlling Russian olive. It's another one of these that birds are the way we're spreading it. So I'm with Christie. You manage them constantly because it's different sites, it's different species. And as Duck said, I've always got a neighbor upstream who's going to send seed to me, even if I control it on my own property.
We are getting to the end of our time, so if any of you have some parting thought, I kind of like to just keep going and constantly, but any additional thoughts would be very much appreciated as we wrap up here.
I'd just like to say thank you everyone for joining, and it's been an interesting year for a lot of us, and I really honor the work that everyone's doing in conservation, no matter who you work for, whether it's state, private, nonprofit, federal. I think it's really important, and we're here to root you on, just like you're rooting us on.
Yeah, I'd like to just echo Christie, and you're talking about federal, you're talking about state, you're talking about nonprofit, you're talking about private management, and at the end of the day, we're all looking to provide habitat, and we're using the same tools, and we're working on different landowners' property, but it's a shared goal that what we're working on. So it's great to hear Duck and Jeff and Christie kind of talking about their situations and go, man, I've been there, or I am there, or I'm about to be there. Because we're facing the same issues, but we're all doing the same work.
Being semi-retired and staying involved in the conservation community, I encourage all of you, hurry up and get retired. It's great. But keep involved in your conservation community, keep spreading the good word. And my wife says I kind of tend to go to preaching on wildlife forestry at times, but I get enthusiastic about it, and it's a blast to work in. It's been real interesting to see a wide variety of forests and habitat on the private sector and after having the public sector time. So y'all keep it up.
Yeah, I'll just kind of finish with this. I just thought about it while I was listening to you three talk. It's easy to be to fall into the rut of being negative and man, things aren't as good as they used to be, and it was always better back then. But as far as in the land conservation, especially bird arena, I mean, this is when I hadn't had a long career, 28 years, but when I started, we argued far more, biologists, foresters, land managers. Nowadays, it seems like there's in the last decade or so, a fairly unified goal to manage forests, whether you're talking to industry or agencies or private landowners, they're managing their forests basically for the same goal, to provide just, good habitat, make revenue off their timber, but do it socially responsible. So it's just cool that we having these kind of webinars, and it's cool that we're in a place now that that no, it's a hell of a lot more positive, and folks should understand how positive this realm that we're working in is nowadays. I'm happy that this is the tail end of my career and we're at this place.
Well, thank you all so much for your time and your expertise and your experience, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you need Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters continuing education credit, please reach out to Jim Siegel. His information is in the flyer that you received as a reminder, and we will also add it in the chat here. Another reminder, our next webinar is on managing forest habitat for pollinators. That webinar will be on Tuesday, June 17th at 12 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. And we look forward to seeing you all there.